Now, the next speaker, Hans is a recent friend. Curtis Hill is a recent friend. But Ken Blackwell, I feel like I've known for, I don't know, I don't have fingers and toes. But he's actually part of our advisory board for Freedom Journal Institute. And his best part, Rosa Blackwell, is here, and I just found out she's an AKA. And my wife is an AKA. I can't believe I said that. My wife is an AKA. My mother's a Delta, so I'm sorry. So anyway, he is a former mayor of Cincinnati. And every time I think of that, I think of WKRP in Cincinnati. He's a former treasurer of Ohio, Secretary of State, so he knows a little bit about this subject matter. And actually, I think you've participated in a number of different elections across the globe, actually. So I don't know if he's going to touch on any of that or not, but he's currently the chairman of election integrity for the America First Policy Institute. And before he gets up to speak, we have a video for you.
Election integrity is the lifeblood of our constitutional republic. Ken Blackwell, chairman of the Center for Election Integrity. America is an idea and it is a promise that the individual matters. You get a sense of empowerment when you cast your ballot because it takes you out of the category of a subject and making you a citizen. As former Secretary of State and top election official in a historic battleground state, I've been on the front lines of building capacity to make sure that there is election integrity. We must make sure that people have confidence in our system, that we have a tight chain of custody, we have verification systems, and that we give folks a fair count. We must protect the state's rights to, in fact, set those policies that the Constitution has afforded them. The last thing that we need is the federalization of our election system. We will continue to work hard to advance policies that enhance voter confidence in elections. We want to make it easy to vote, but hard to cheat. The American experience in elections at its best takes place at the local level. Neighbors serving neighbors. When you have that understanding, you have good policy, good administration, and secure elections.
We brought in folks who, before our eyes, hacked election machines.
There were problems in this election. Before the election, there were complaints about absentee ballots, and the patchwork use of provisional ballots led to unequal treatment under the law.
You can run the best campaign. You can even become the nominee. And you can have the election stolen from you.
That's why we need paper trails on these new electronic machines so that you actually have something that you can hang on to after you've punched that letter. Make sure that it hasn't been hacked into.
I'm very concerned that you could have a hack that finally went through.
Researchers have repeatedly demonstrated that ballot recording machines and other voting systems are susceptible to tampering.
I agree with tens of millions of Americans who are very worried that when they cast the ballot on an electronic voting machine, that there is no paper trail to record that vote.
We received more than 50,000 phone calls of people who were denied the right to vote. I am complicit if I say that that system is fair.
Good afternoon. It's indeed a pleasure to be with you. Eric, let me just say that after listening to you, Jennifer, Hans, Curtis, I'm of a mind of raising the same questions that Admiral Stockdale raised. Who am I, and what am I doing here? You all have covered the waterfront and done it quite well. Let me try to lace it together with some thoughts about who we are as a nation in our 246 years of existence as an exceptional, not perfect, but an exceptional constitutional republic. That through its history of trials and tribulations, citizen engagement, and the activity and the human agency of folks who are standing in the gap between America's promise and America's practice, we in fact still have work to do to protect that status, because there are forces who want to destroy American exceptionalism. Let me put it within a biblical framework. Hebrew 12, verse 1, there's a question that is raised. Talks about a cloud of witnesses watching over us, wondering how we will run the race marked out for us. In John 3, we're told that those who would do evil love the darkness. And throughout the Bible, we are told that God has invested in us not just human agency, but a light. And that our obligation is not to put that light under a bushel, but to raise it high, not only to celebrate his magnificence, but to punch holes in the darkness of our time. And so one of the things that we know, and which has been underscored here, is that the foundation of the American system of self-governance is liberty. And the core expression, as Curtis indicated, of a people's liberty is the ability to vote in free and fair elections. And so safeguarding the integrity of our elections is paramount to the preservation of our republic in this 246 years of our existence. Underscored again by Lincoln's observation that we are not a perfect union, but we are a perfectible union. Through our engagement, we can make America better by making reforms that we need to make to protect liberty and the moral foundation upon which our country is based. That Declaration of Independence and that paragraph that Curtis made reference to, that begins, we hold these truths to be self-evident. My dad used to say that that's a highfalutin way of saying any knucklehead should be able to get this. That we're endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights. That our fundamental human rights are not grants from government, but they're gifts from God. There have been struggles throughout human history between the notion of individual liberty and the muscularity of government. Aristotle talked about that dynamic tension between the organized power of the state and individual liberty. The more powerful, the more muscular the state, the less liberty. we have as individuals, free citizens, exercising the human agency that God had invested in each and every one of us. And so we continue to look at the founders and the framers' understanding of that tension and what they did to give freedom the chance of flourishing and individual liberty the chance of winning. They put a harness on the reach and power of the central or federal government. They utilize a principle of subsidiarity, meaning that government that works best is government that's closest to the people. And the first governance unit is the family. And so as one who has crisscrossed this globe dozens of times, not just during elections, but as the U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations Human Rights Commission, looking at that tension between authoritarian forms of government, totalitarian forms of government, and yes, big welfare states, what we see that they have in common is the destruction of the human family to build a dependency on the central or federal or muscular government, and to, in fact, convert us from free citizens to subjects. And so one of the things that we know about the way that our election system was constructed was that they decentralized power. They pushed it back to local states and local governments. And one of the things that they realized, again, working through this, because the principles that underlie our system were not always adhered to. But one of the things that we have to come to grips with is that they understood the benefits of doing elections at the state and local level. Not only did it keep concentrated power out of the hands of the central or federal government, just think about how much common sense it made to do elections at the precinct level, neighbors working with neighbors. What did you get from that? You got a tight chain of custody. What do you get today with this notion of accelerating the use of mail-in balloting? Too many hands, touching too many ballots, with too few eyes being able to follow the process. One of the things that I know is that that commission, chaired by Carter and Baker, one of the things that they recommended against was the utilization in a massive sort of way of mail-in balloting, because they understood the deficiencies of the post office, and they understood that you stretched it out to a point where you had too many hands touching the ballot after it left the stroke of the pen or the punch of the voter until when it was counted. And they knew you had too few eyes on the process. And so there is real magic and common sense applied to looking at systems that improve the ability of folks at the local level to engage in the election process. I'll try to give human and practical application to something that we talked about. Rosa, my wife for 54 years, and I are shareholders of the Cincinnati Reds. Dr. Wallace, if I left tickets at the will call window for you and Jennifer to come up to a Cincinnati Reds game, and you walked up to that will call window and they asked you for verification, and you showed them your utility bill, do you think that would work? No. Let me further expand on that app. Major League Baseball decided to move the All-Star game from Atlanta, Georgia to Denver, Colorado. They said they did it because of the voter suppression laws and reforms that have been put in place, most notably the use of photo ID. Now, what they did by using the photo ID as a basis to move the All-Star game, they took an event that had an economic impact of $110 million on a city that is overwhelmingly black in its population, move it to a Denver, Colorado that is proportionally overwhelmingly white. And guess what? The state of Colorado have stricter election laws than the state of Georgia. It is a walking contradiction. I want to underscore something that is just, again, very important, coming from gatherings like this, and that is that we, in fact, should understand that it is our engagement that matters. What they did, they slapped a nice title utilizing the emotional tie of the name of Congressman John Lewis and his involvement in the civil rights movement. They put it on a piece of federal legislation that would have centralized and federalized our election system, doing away with that effective decentralization, taking away the concentration of power from the federal government, which to me is now being run by a clown car. That is bent on making sure that we radically change the structure of governance, moving it away from the family, the city, the county, and state government to a federally controlled system. The philosophy that underlies their moves are much in line with the philosophies, again, of totalitarian, authoritarian, and big welfare states. I was saying to someone earlier that as I crisscrossed the globe and I really studied the culture of totalitarian forms of government, we watch as they do two things. They crush the family. Mao did it in the 60s and 70s. He created a situation and a culture where you had children committing their parents to re-education camps, well documented. You see today a regime or a group of folks who are advocating that parents don't have rights to determine things that have historically been left to them to decide about how they raise their kids. But it's consistent. The other thing that you see in those totalitarian big welfare states, authoritarian states, is the running of God and faith out of the public square. Government becomes the provider, the decider of fundamental human rights. Not God, not the individual, not the family, not the church. It is no accident that the two dominating characteristics of those forms of government is to run God and faith out of the public square, to crush the family. And that is what gives so much meaning to the principles of RISE. But I want to make sure that we stay focused. It is crazy to think that there has not been progress made. When I was senior in high school, freshman and sophomore in college, just old enough to drive but not old enough to vote, because that change took place in 1970. In Chattanooga, Tennessee, in Clarksdale, Mississippi, where they were fighting for real reforms, this is what happened. Voters, black voters, would go into a polling booth, and there was a jar of jelly beans. If they couldn't say how many jelly beans were in that jar, they had to turn around and go home. That was voter intimidation, voter suppression, discrimination. Hans just gave it to you clearly. We're not there anymore. Curtis provided it. We are, in fact, way beyond. We've made progress. You know, again, it calls for internal vigilance and engagement. But I will tell you what the challenge is now, as we see an attempt to destroy our status as a nation state. And while the policies and practices of not just this administration, but the lackness in other administrations past, is that with a wide open border, we are becoming a nation without borders. And we find that now folks want to make us, or put us in a situation where we have citizens without borders. And if you don't think that every town in this country, because of our open border in the South, is becoming a border town, take a look at the crime wave, the escalation of human trafficking. And if you don't think that, or if you think that this is an exaggeration, there is now a concentrated attack on the concept of citizenship. Who is a citizen? What rights do they have? And this is something that I wrote about in the Yale Law Review in 2009. People forget they're not just rights of citizens in this country, there are duties. Now, those duties can't be overwhelmingly taxing, but common sense. So if, in fact, showing a free photo ID is one of the duties of American citizenship, can you really say, as the previous speakers have suggested, that this is crazy, burdensome, suppressive, repressive? No, you can't. And so I'm asking you to make the connection between the integrity of American citizenship, the integrity of us as a nation state, our 246-year history of understanding, putting reasonable constraints on the overreach and the muscularity of the federal government, is consistent with advancing human liberty. Engage. Action, action, action is so important. I want to give you a perspective I I've chaired and I co-chair the International Foundation for Electoral Systems. We do elections all over the world, most notably in developing countries. And it is a strictly bipartisan organization. The chairman now is the former campaign strategist for Bernie Sanders. Even number of Democrats and Republicans, just like the Carter-Baker Commission. We don't see any other nation in the world using mail-in balloting like it's being proposed. But one of the things that I've learned from working with these folks, who are I consider to be friends, just on the wrong track, is that many of the folks who they work with talk about never letting a crisis go to waste. So the question becomes, how do we get into this situation where there has been a loosening of the chain of custody and a trashing of verification policies and systems? I want you to think about the last 100 years. In 1918, we in fact had the Spanish flu pandemic. In 1929, we had major economic disruption. 1968, we had waves of urban violence. In 1974, we had an impeachment crisis. In 2020, we had all of the above. It was the perfect storm, the perfect disruption that was used to loosen the chain of custody, to trash, to push to the sideline verification systems, and to allow for dollars from private sector, private citizens to put a thumb on the scale and to make a mockery out of fairness. Ballot curing took place in selected precincts and now in others. The unattended to drop boxes. Ladies and gentlemen, that was the perfect storm. The perfect prescription is for us to engage, for us to be a part of the process, for us not to be naive to think that the system is perfect, but that we're, as Will Rogers said, we don't let yesterday use up too much of today. Get involved, protect your freedom, protect your family, and make sure that God and faith is not run out of the public square. Be a champion of individual liberty and free and fair elections. Thank you.